At number 9 Luxun Road in Dalian stands a 100-year-old European-style building. Prior to the war, it served as the headquarters of Manchuria Railway. Almost all plans of aggression and expansion against China were hatched inside this building, which masqueraded under the name Manchuria Railway Investigation Department. Three years after the invasion, Japan found itself frustrated. Its ambitious north and south advance had still failed to find a solid footing in China. Why was China so tenacious, so unyielding? The Japanese were anxious to find an answer. The answer came in March 1940 from inside this building. China's resistance came primarily from the countryside, and at the center of China's military strength were the common people, led by the Communist Party of China. The darkest period of the war came between 1941 and 1942, when fascism was rampant across the globe, and was also the most difficult time in China's war against Japanese aggression. On June the 22nd, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and at the same time, the Russo-German War broke out. On December the 8th, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the US at Pearl Harbor, and with it, the Pacific War had begun. By this time, a large part of China had fallen to the Japanese army. Japan hoped to make these provinces its rear base. The battles conducted behind enemy lines by CPC forces were more crucial than ever before. Japan placed 2/3 of its troops in China and used 90% of its puppet armies for a mopping up campaign against anti-Japan bases. Their strategy was simple: burn all, kill all, and loot all. Battlefields under the CPC's leadership behind enemy lines played a vital role, and this is how. Yan'an, the beacon of China's anti-Japanese war effort and headquarters for resistance behind enemy lines, became the prime target of the Japanese army. It was bombed 17 times, the Japanese dropping 1,690 bombs total. Almost all of the buildings inside the city were leveled, over 1,000 of which belonged to the CPC Central Committee.
飞机走了以后，我们到现场一看，到处是死手轰着，有的胳膊，有的手挂在树上。
American journalist Harrison Foreman described the scene simply in his reports of Red China as, "The city of Yan'an became piles of rubble." On January the 25th, 1941, 6,000 Japanese and puppet troops besieged Panjiayu in Hebei province. They set everything on fire and killed everyone they saw on sight.
日本人把那个孩子提了手往墙摔，摔的这个，说实在把脑瓜子都摔碎了，对，往墙上，那个脑子他们都吃下子都窜出来，连血在脑子的，都那一枪。
The killing lasted an entire day, leaving the village in ruins and over 800 bodies that were no longer recognizable. Of the 1,537 villagers, only 307 survived. Their belongings were taken away, their homes destroyed. Lei Ye, frontline reporter for the 8th Route Army, recorded the massacre. Songs of old sung by young shepherds, or the coughing of old men, was no more. Neither cooking smoke nor light could be seen. After we finished our mission in dusk, we found nobody to say goodbye to.
那到这第二天，多卷抓的人都上来，有亲戚的、没亲戚的、不是亲戚的都来了，在这帮着买呀，来了都是拿着炕皮头子， 那么都收来呢，连炕席都没有啊，都是外头拿来的炕席头子，卷上一个人一卷上人出呢。
Unrecognizable bodies were buried en masse. 4 tombs, 2 for men, 1 for women and 1 for children, were made. May they rest in peace. "74 years on, the pain remains. Descendants have grown older, and kneeling before the tombs, they release cries of anguish for their lost loved ones." This massacre was just one of many carried out by the Japanese army in China. 5 months later, Lei Ye died when he rushed to warn people in the next village to flee from the advancing Japanese army. After years of battling anti-Japanese forces, the Japanese army realized that the root of China's resistance lay within the general public. So, as long as there was a public, there was an anti-Japanese force. In China's northeast, the Japanese set up no-man zones, with which they hoped to separate the anti-Japanese forces from the local people. They also implemented this plan in northern China. In this 50,000 square kilometer area, the Japanese army practiced a concentration of families and villages strategy. Through the act of killing and destroying villages, they forced 1.4 million people to stay in human pens in order to create large swathes of no man's land. A human pen was like a concentration camp, and people were kept inside by wide, deep trenches surrounding the camp. The circling walls had barbed wire or wild jujube branches on top. Blockhouses were located on each corner, at each entrance, and also along major streets. At the center of a human pen was a tall watchtower, and each human pen only had 2 entrances, guarded by soldiers. The mastermind behind these human pens was Suzuki Keiku, a war criminal later put to public trial in June 1956 in China. According to his memory, he killed at least 5,470 Chinese.
またその家屋は焼き払うべき家屋は1万数千個になると私は考えています。この家屋も住民立ち退きの際には自ら火をつけさせるか、あるいは
Over 350,000 people died in these human pens. The vast no-man's land became a mass grave. Several mass graves can still be seen today in the wilderness next to Moguyu village, located in Hebei province. And so, after many years, villagers still remember the dead.
他说你私通马路匪，都给拿个罪名啊，都到这儿都开始把脑袋给砍掉了，砍死以后直接一脚给搞坑子里去了，都埋上去了。
拿枪打
啊，
有拿刀砍的，
拿刀砍，
有拿枪可突突的。
啊，人多了那情况下，那都是拿枪打，
那可
杀不过来。
这么高小孩子都给突突了，你那多狠呢？你对他有啥时候他恨呢？
Okamura Yasuji, commanding officer of the Wuhan campaign, was made general commander in northern China by the Japanese emperor in July 1941. Okamura Yasuji knew more about China than any other Japanese general. His appointment was made after the Japanese military reassessed the situation happening in the occupied area. With Japan's shift in strategy and focus, the Kuomintang became even more passive in resistance. While reluctantly continuing with the United Front, its policies became increasingly anti-CPC. This led to the Southern Anhui incident, during which the new Fourth Army commanding officer Ye Ting was detained and an estimated 7,000 was slaughtered. Between 1941 and 1942, northern China was ravaged by a serious drought, followed by a plague of locusts. Central China then suffered severe flooding, which left farmers with nothing to harvest. Natural and man-made disasters put the resistance forces in the Japanese-occupied areas under suppression. The resistance base area shrank, and the population was down to just 50 million. Troops of the 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army decreased from 500,000 to 400,000, and the financial situation became dire.
是我们最困难的事情，啊，当时用文学的语言来讲，叫做黎明前的黑暗，最困难了。
In response, the CPC strengthened its efforts on the battleground. It reduced rent and interest rates for farmers. The CPC brought a positive impact with better troops, less bureaucracy, and promotion of agriculture. The towering Yanshan Mountains, the torrential Yishui River, the 5 heroes who fought to death on Mount Langya will be remembered forever. On September the 25th, 1941, thousands of CPC troops and civilians were besieged on Mount Langya by Japanese troops and their puppet armies. Acting as a cover, 5 8th Route Army soldiers, Ma Boyu, Hu Delin, Hu Fucai, Ge Zhenlin, and Song Xueyi lured Japanese troops up to the peak. When they ran out of ammunition, they smashed their rifles before jumping off the cliff. They were only 5, a Japanese officer wrote, but they were willing to die to cover their main army. Inside a former 8th Route Army textile factory in Xishe village, a stone monument in memory of the fallen soldiers remains. Weather beaten, its inscription is still legible. A Japanese veteran confirmed that the 8th Route Army didn't fire until the Japanese came within 150 meters. Seconds after they fired shots, they fearlessly charged with bayoneted rifles. They stopped at nothing until they stabbed the enemy, even though it meant that they themselves were stabbed and killed. The arrogant and complacent Japanese troops were overwhelmed.
行った兵隊は八路軍は立派だという。それは何が立派かといえば、私が聞いたある例で言えば、八路軍をある村で包囲して、これは包囲討伐戦の段階です。包囲討伐した後ですね、追い詰められた八路軍の兵士がですね、この屋根の上に上がって最後の一発の手榴弾、手榴弾とも言いますけど、手榴弾を持ってですね、日本兵見ろと。ね、我々中国のですね、人民は、ね、日本に投降しないぞってそういうことを叫んで、それで日本兵が見守る中で自決して、最後の一発の手榴弾を残して、自決したそうです。
Though poorly equipped, the CPC troops were prepared to die. Many of them did not even have bayonets. Notes like, "Exchange this for a Japanese rifle," were often seen attached to their spears. Peng Xuefeng, commanding officer of the 4th Division of the new 4th Army, wrote in the article "Frequent Use of Primitive Weapons" about the importance of organizing people to participate in the anti-Japanese war.
Но снабжение этих партизанских отрядов, в отличие от советских партизан, они осуществлялись за счет японской армии, что партизаны, как говорится, достанут, отвоюют при разгроме частей японской армии, то тем они и воевали.
This S-shaped ravine extends for dozens of kilometers. On both sides are steep cliffs. Huangyadong is the former site of the first and largest arms factory in the occupied area. The rifles, artillery, mines and grenades it produced were enough to arm 16 regiments. In Peng Dehuai's words, "Having it, we have a tiger on flat ground."
黄阳洞是华北抗日战争中间武器的主要来源。除了打仗、缴获敌人的以外，我们的武器弹药就是要从黄阳洞来。
The arms factory was a thorn in the side of the Japanese occupation. Over 7,000 Japanese troops assembled on November 11th, 1941. 1,000 soldiers from the 8th Route Army, led by Peng Dehuai and Zuo Chuan, resisted for 8 days and nights. For every Chinese soldier killed, the Japanese lost 6. The CPC Central Military Commission spoke highly of this battle. Of all the battles we fought in 1941, the Huangyadong was the prime example. Elsewhere, the Second World War had entered a tense phase. In just 6 months, almost 4 million square kilometers of land in Southeast Asia fell into Japanese hands. On February the 15th, 1942, almost 100,000 British troops in Singapore surrendered to the Japanese. 75,000 troops from the American Philippine United Army surrendered on April the 9th in the Philippines. The Japanese fascists were at the peak of their aggression. In China, hundreds of thousands of Kuomintang troops at the enemy's rear switched sides, including dozens of generals. Despite this, the anti-Japanese forces under the leadership of the CPC were still hanging on. By May 1942, the headquarters of the 8th Route Army had a very small squad for security, as all soldiers had been sent to the front line. Sensing an opportunity, over 30,000 Japanese troops attacked the Taihang and Taiyue base areas. Their target was the 8th Route Army's headquarters and camps of Division 129. Their best soldiers were selected as plainclothes operatives to launch a decisive, fatal blow, with large army support behind them. The commanding officers of the 8th Route Army were their targets. On May the 25th, the CPC Central Committee headquarters was under siege. Zuo Chuan pleaded with Vice Commander-in-Chief Peng Dehuai to leave first before he led his men north, creating a distraction for the advancing Japanese troops. They met Japanese troops at Shizi Ridge. Artillery shells fell like raindrops, and Zuo Quan was killed. Not only Zuo Quan, but many high-level officers were killed in this battle. This was the biggest loss dealt to the 8th Route Army since the beginning of the war. Yan An lost contact with the headquarters for 3 days. When Zuo Quan's pistol was brought back to Peng Dehuai, Peng was grief-stricken. Zuo Quan had been an excellent officer, graduating from Frunze Military Academy in Moscow. During the Long March, he was Chief of Staff for the 1st Red Group Army. According to his wife, Liu Zhilan, Zuo Quan had nothing else on his mind but the 100 Regiments campaign. Even though victory was a sure thing, he was sleepless at night, restlessly going over details. This is the only photo remaining of Zuo Quan's family. His daughter was not even 100 days old. Did she know she would never see her father again? After the Japanese ambush attack, the Central Committee of the CPC asked the 8th Route Army Headquarters to move to northwest Shanxi, but Peng Dehuai insisted that he would not leave. His request was approved. The headquarters changed their location 60 times during the anti-Japanese war, but never far away from the front line or from these mountains. Elsewhere in China, the situation was also difficult. The CPC's anti-Japanese bases were all under huge pressure. Bloody battles were fought daily, and the nation was suffering terribly. On December the 17th, 1942, the CPC Central Committee called upon everyone fighting behind the enemy's line to clench teeth to bear the most difficult years of prolonged guerrilla warfare.
毛主席告诉大家，我们是进行人民战争。我们共产党呢，克里兹森的法宝呢，就是人民战争，动员人民、组织人民、武装人民。
With the exception of major forces, the Central Committee ordered the rest of troops to conduct guerrilla warfare in small groups at the enemy's rear.
县委书记刘开基与大家讲，我们是正义的敌人，群众当时还不信任，说是当时人家日军武器强，这人我们咋能老百姓谁能没武器，我们咋能胜利了？啊，刘开基说是。 他要怕死了，他要不怕死，他为什么戴钢盔了？这就是这，如果我们必须得对阵，不对阵就没活力。
Major forces, local troops, and militia all faced various kinds of combat, such as tunnel warfare, mine warfare, marine warfare, transportation sabotage, and joint defense between military and civilians. These uniquely Chinese tactics in the East proved very effective. The vast plains of northern China gave no good terrain for guerrilla warfare, so people engaged in tunnel warfare. Tunnels are often used to hide from danger. In China, they developed into a battle tactic never seen before. When Japanese troops were attacking above ground, resistance forces and civilians were underground in tunnels leading to every house as well as nearby villages. They were used for defense and attack. Of all the tunnels dug, the ones in Ranzhuang village of Hebei province were a fine example. The tunnels allowed people to hide, maneuver, and attack, leaving Japanese troops in despair and confusion. If connected end to end, one of the former Japanese troops recalled, they might be longer than the Great Wall. They made central Hebei province a big headache for us. But for the 8th Route Army, they were definitely something to be proud of. A US Army officer was hugely impressed after seeing them in December 1944. "I'm the first US Army officer to get into them," he said proudly to anyone he met. Another tactic that left Japanese troops terror-struck was mine warfare. A unique and ingenious tactic of combining mines and artillery was used by a soldier named Li Yong.
既然走过去了，这里也没响。他既然快过了这个弯儿了，李勇这才赶紧抓起枪来，朝着头里那敌人梆着打了2枪，俺们就都离开了哩，俺不能光在根儿里，打2枪以后。 是把那个都给打死了。敌人这把两边的一爬一扑，2个地雷就没着，擦响了。
Guerrilla warfare also extended to the water. Resistance forces in Baiyangdian Lake disguised themselves with white towels upon their heads and attached goose feathers to their boats. Their tactics proved very effective in fighting the Japanese troops. For over 700 years, coal had been mined at Zaozhuang. Even since the Republican years, it was the largest coal source in northern China. Even today, the huge slag heap next to the city remains to tell Zaozhuang's story. The 13 million tons of coal taken by the Japanese army from here during the war were part of their scheme of resourcing the war with war. Stopping this scheme was the priority for CPC's local forces. The South Shandong Railway guerrillas were a small but active force along Japanese transportation lines, containing much of the Japanese force within this area by repeatedly cutting their transportation links. Luo Ronghuan, political commissar of Division 115 of the 8th Route Army, described their deeds as a knife deep into the enemy's chest. Resistance forces developed a very effective strategy against the Japanese army's cage tactics. Armed teams were sent to the enemy's rear.
应该是拿炮楼的拿据点，哎，
有的时候挖地道，有的时候呢，利用做买卖打进去，了解敌人情况。晚上呢，就给他爆破，叫他炮楼的给他炸。了解好了，就可以呢，叫他上西天蹦了。
Qinyuan County is a remote and mountainous place in western Shanxi. After an operation of Big Sweep, a small force of troops left behind by the Japanese to implement a new policy of occupy through politics rather than force remained. In order to squeeze these Japanese troops out, the 8th Route Army Taiyue Division formed a new office to better coordinate contact between guerrillas and local militia. They stopped at nothing in the county city, harassing Japanese troops day and night through sparrow warfare, ambushes, sabotage operations, snipers, and mines. Japanese troops were trapped.
我们和敌人真的群众的对阵，谁有群众，谁就能胜利。杀是我们的杀，累是我们的累。我们可以限制敌人嘴累，不能叫他扩散出来。没有人与他服，他就不能生存。
The subsequent 883 days of besiegement saw Qinyuan locals fight 2,730 skirmishes, killing 4,200 Japanese. The rest had no choice but to flee. General Chen Geng said, "Victory belongs to those who finish last."
Allowed for an awful lot of experimentation and adaptability on a local level, which militarily meant that small forces could be very, very effective at harassing and causing problems for the Japanese.
Another force under the CPC was the new 4th Army, active in the Yangtze River area, in the area ruled by Wang Jingwei's puppet regime. Big sweep actions against the new 4th Army never ceased. Between 1941 and 1943, the army repelled tens of Japanese attempts. They held on in the central part of China. The company named after hero Liu Laozhuang is probably one of the most famous in today's People's Liberation Army. The company will appear in the 2015 military parade to mark the 70th anniversary of victory in the anti-Japanese war. After protecting the local CPC department and safely relocating civilians on March the 18th, 1943, the opportunity for the company of the new 4th Army to safely retreat was gone. They vowed to stay, to fight until the death. From dusk until dawn, they fought until all their ammunition was spent. At the signal from the company commander, they equipped bayonets for close-range combat. All 82 of them fought to the death. Villagers wrapped their bodies with cotton quilts. They built a large tomb for them. 82 young men were even selected from the village to make a new 4th company. And this is the meaning of how the company got its name, Liu Laozhuang Company. In the years to come, the village had more men in that army than any other. A popular song was sung in every anti-Japanese base. Mothers send sons to join the fight against Japanese army. Wives see off husbands to the battlefield. Men and women, old and young, everyone was part of a resistance group. Young men had self-defense groups. There was a women's association and youths joined the Children's Corps. They carried stretchers for the wounded, stood guard, sent food and water, made clothes for soldiers, and delivered information. A parentless young cow herder named Wang Erxiao died fighting the Japanese. His story has been told over the past 70 years to inspire one generation after another. Sadly, he left no photos, but his image has been etched into the mind of every Chinese young person. To the youth of 70 years ago, national salvation was as much of a duty as it was to adults. Her name was Rong Guanxiu. She was a model mother to the anti-Japanese front. Mothers like her played their part for the resistance cause. In Dongxinzhuang village of Shandong province, the 100-year-old Wang Huanyu used to live in an equally old house. During the anti-Japanese war, she risked her life to shelter orphans left by 8th Route Army soldiers killed in action.
俺婆婆，俺就说，我是革命的后人呀，在好上进去看，那时候什么都人人都有，哪让人家怕，爹心就那的，全方位就是要孩子，把孩子养起来。
Zhang Shuzhen had just had a baby and was still producing milk. "Give your milk to children of the martyrs first," her mother-in-law said to her. "If we lose our baby, you can have another one. If anything happens to these orphans, their family line will end." More and more children were orphaned, with more and more 8th Route Army soldiers killed. Zhang Shuzhen and other mothers gave up everything they had to keep them. All the orphans survived, but 4 of their own babies didn't, dying instead of malnutrition. Mobilizing and arming the people was key to sustaining this protracted warfare. Relying on people was one of the CPC's most significant strategies. The village of Kongjiajiao is surrounded on 3 sides by mountains. Even today, it remains remote. Buried underground, behind the house of village elder and chief Guo Jianren, is a secret kept by 3 generations for 70 years.
这个岗位呢，在这儿呢，八路军那个东西都在那个岗下边放着呢，上边只能伪装。 但是有一次以北还挖开过，拿出来就把下边的东西就一道暴露了。
This secret vat was used to keep important documents from the headquarters of the 8th Route Army.
孔家就村，部队要拿走
军械做军械，收了军械，
五箱运来的粮食，这个米是4300多斤，小麦是8000多斤。 这个是这个济南银行的雷队工厂，
八路军的第一个济南银行，每一个老百姓都把那个军粮给他们分开保护，分别保护起来。
你看，这是这个 八路军后勤部的副部长周维龙写给这个我老爷爷，叫郭建仁，他是当时是孔家校村的村长，写给他的一封信。他当时8月更开的这个生产扩大会，发的表有面体表、土地人口表，都是印给你们的。
These documents record almost all aspects of life back then. Today, hundreds of relics of the past can still be seen in and around the local town. They tell the history, the sufferings people had, and the glories that they achieved. Consolidating anti-Japanese bases in the occupied areas was fundamental to maintaining resistance through guerrilla warfare. Every base elected a local government, constituted with a third from members of the CPC, a third non-CPC, and a third with no affiliations to any political group. This structure represented social strata at the time. Xi Zhongxun was once the leader of the Shanxi and Gansu revolutionary base. During the anti-Japanese war, he also served as secretary of the Guangdong and Suide party committees and as the political commissar of the Suide garrison. In addition, he advanced the founding of anti-Japanese democratic authorities. Mao Zedong called Xi Zhongxun a leader of the masses who came from the masses. For the first time, people in these revolutionary bases knew what democracy and equality meant.
我在蔡家沟住，县长去了。李大爷啊，那时候50多岁，县长大老爷，程县长谁叫你喊我大老爷的？那俺没见过县长，就是看着唱戏啊、说书的都是县长是大老爷。咱们是兄弟，不准喊大老爷。我也不是人民的大老爷，我是人民的仆人。我们民主政府抗日民主政府。
Constantly surrounded and attacked by Japanese troops, every anti-Japan base faced great difficulties.
自杀的说起来，哎呀，最苦的老百姓最苦，部队最苦，到这一辈最苦了。一天吃的也少了，吃的还都白白，过了个上。
As Mao Zedong called on people to do it oneself to improve life, people in revolutionary bases strived to increase productivity. CPC leaders were amongst them. Everyone was dressed in the same coarse clothes and had the same coarse food. They were often seen weaving cloth on looms. The Jiangbei Canal, the largest water conservancy project the 8th Route Army built for local people, is still in use today. The project was launched by Liu Bochang and Deng Xiaoping to bring drought relief. Long live the Communist Party of China, local people shouted when the project was completed. Within just 1 year, thanks to the Great Production Campaign, food problems were no more. Logistical support for battlegrounds in the occupied areas was drastically improved. Many wonderful stories about the production campaign are still told today. So just how difficult was life in these bases during the Resistance War? The way the people of Yan'an handled unexploded bombs was very telling. Yan'an residents would take over 100 kilos of TNT from a dud bombshell carry it down Mount Fenghuang to be taken away by horse-drawn carts. TNT was a very good yellow dye, perfect for army uniforms. The shells were smashed into small pieces before being melted down to make hose for reclaiming land. The significant ideological and political rectification movement conducted by the CPC in the spring of 1942 was to make the party more mature and more united. It was an excellent strategy to improve the party's fighting ability.
Frankly, at the time, you know. So it created a nationalist spirit that carries over probably to today in some ways.
Significant victories for the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom and the United States in Stalingrad and Guadalcanal in 1943 turned the worldwide conflict in favor of the Allied powers. The Jin Cha-ji pictorial illustrated how the 8th Route Army fought the Japanese wherever their troops appeared. With the people's support, they grew into an invincible force. The CPC was the vanguard of the national resistance against Japan. Through its heroic efforts in the protracted war, the party was able to unite the nation in crisis. The resistance in the rear of the enemy was fundamental to China's final victory over Japan. The darkest time in the global struggle against fascism was ending. Victory was in sight.
长城见血几道枪，女儿如铁男儿刚。中流击水擎天柱，浴火重生立东方。5000年文明不曾消亡，中华民族不畏惧创伤，看我祖先日辉煌，追求复兴梦想。